Deborah Stratman is the film director. Okay, now we are really in the spotlight. She works with film, with video, but she also experiments with other media. She makes sound installations and also sculptures and paintings, and her installations and her work were shown at various festivals and galleries throughout the world. And when I first saw your work, your films, I was really amazed, especially by the way how you can pick up certain details from the reality, and how you mix the different genres and different approaches. I saw several films that were on the border, or that worked with certain staged parts, but also with a very strong documentary footage, and also it's absolutely amazing how you work with the images, and how you use them, and how you appropriate them. So I'm very happy that you are here. Thank you for coming, and I'm happy that you are going to have your masterclass and tell the audience about your method and how you think about the film.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I'll just start. How about that? Please. Okay. Oh, is this mine? No, I have mine. Okay. So, can we have less lights in the theater? I want to encourage people, if you have questions, to ask. If I don't see you, try to be more gestural with your hands. So I'm going to start without speaking. Okay, I think it's playing though. I just wasn't sure what was having a half there. So I want to start with this. We'll go back. Do you have something? Okay, good. So this is the very beginning of a piece called The Name Is Not the Thing Named from 2012. It's about 11-minute piece. And you keep going through this tunnel until you eventually come out a different end. It's a short film that's in support of experiences that are essentially common, but to which language doesn't easily adhere. And so the places of the film are both themselves, but they're also always stand-ins for other places. And the title, The Name Is Not the Thing Named, is taken from Aleister Crowley's 1918 translation of the Tao Te Ching. Let's go with some more sounds. So when I was thinking about this class, I thought I would talk about it as considering the interval. Obviously, the interval is a pretty big subject. So more specifically, a recurring interest in my own work in the interval as it manifests itself in gaps or holes or circuits or loops. And since there was a short of mine that showed here called Hacked Circuit, which some of you may have seen, I thought I didn't want to screen that, but it could be sort of a beginning place to speak about these considerations of the interval. So for those of you who didn't see it, just by way of brief description, it's a single tracking shot that takes us inside of the art of oral illusion. And through its track, it sort of reveals that not everything is as it seems or as it sounds. There are a number of reasons why I wanted to work with the loop. One of the primary ones is that I find it an essentially paranoid form, where if you're in a paranoid kind of thinking, you keep coming back to the same place over and over, and it's a circuit that's hard to get out of. But there is a series of repetitions and mirrorings that permeate the work. So in this long tracking shot that we see, it's about 15 minutes, we observe Foley artists at work, and they're foleying the sound from Coppola's film The Conversation, where Gene Hackman's character it's the last scene, and he's kind of in a paranoid frenzy, wrecking apart his apartment, looking for a bug that's been planted there. But we don't start the tracking shot inside the space. We start outside on the street, where the cues that we have, visual and sonic cues, are such that we don't pay attention to construction. We think about it just, oh, it's just a scene on the street in Burbank. And then as we move inside, there's a series of iterations of reveal where more and more layers of fabrication and more layers of control are sort of made evident. So on one hand, it's a kind of simple portrait of artists at work, but on the other, it's exposing these typically invisible mechanisms that of conjuring, just in terms of the whole sort of Hollywood scene of conjuring that Hollywood is, and also surveillance. So in case you're not familiar with the term Foley, it's the art of reproducing sound effects for film in real time. And its purpose is to complement or to reproduce sounds that were created on the set originally, or field recordings. So Foley artists, when they're working, what was originally so interesting to me about them is they extract sounds from these objects around them. So if you go into their studio, it's totally full of, it looks like a chaotic garage sale or a secondhand shop, because it's in a very eclectic group of objects that'll be in the room, and each one has two identities. It has its normal use identity, which is, if it's a shovel, oh, well, the shovel is for shoveling dirt. But the shovel, the reason they have it, it has a parallel sonic identity, which is whatever metallic and wooden and weight sound that shovel makes. So I like that everything has its normal face value or use value and also a sonic use value. So the reason I wanted to start mentioning this film as a beginning place for everything else is because sound and its use as sort of the way it can function as a mode of social control, but also of resistance, comes back again and again in my work. And one of the reasons I'm so enamored with sound is because when we listen to something, what we're actually listening to is the space around the sound. Sound is always modified by the medium it travels through, so it carries a very distinct signature of place. Sound engulfs, it surrounds the spatial. Bresson has said a number of wonderful things about sound. One really simple thing he said is that the locomotive's whistle imprints upon us the whole railroad station. So it's also a very efficient marker of the present, of the here and now, because of the nature of sound. You know, the sound is here, and then it's immediately changing and disappearing. In other words, sound is always vectored in time. Sound dissipates. So because of those things, we instinctively ascribe to them a here and nowness that we might not to image. So for these and a lot of other physiological reasons, we have an unconscious belief in our oral surroundings. You know, again, Bresson, he talked about how the eye sees, but the ear imagines. So the way we process what we hear has been taken advantage of over and over again in some really ingeniously subversive ways, sometimes declaratively, as with anthems or artillery, or deceptively, as with sonic decoys or surveillance. In either event, the audiosphere is well disposed to militarization because we don't bring to it the same critical faculties that we do perhaps what we look at with our eyes. So the questions that I ask through all my work is,
can I ask if you have someone on a Mac to solve the problem with PowerPoint? Or
solve the problem with the what?
with PowerPoint, you have.
Oh no, I think we're solved.
It's solved?
I think so.
Okay, it's great.
Yeah, it just looks stuck, but actually it's not. It's changing really slowly. No, it's not really changing. It's just there, but I think it's temporarily solved though. If it breaks down again, I'll try to deal with it. So the questions that I keep asking every time, whether it's cinema or sculpture I'm working in, is how does sound inform us? How does it fool us? How does it control us? And how does it empower us? So the same ways that we may be policed and directed by architecture, or rather, you know, I think just we are policed and directed by architecture. It controls us, the physical building itself, because sound can be a sort of sonic architecture, because sound is also capable of making space. It also potentially could control and police us. I've hijacked this drawing from Ferdinand de Saussure. I'm probably butchering his name. I'm sorry, Raymond. But it's a diagram of linguistic value, basically, and he's talking about, in his use of it, how the language of thought can be organized as sound, where A, the top, would be vague amorphous thought, or sort of unnamed, unexpressed thought before it's expressed by language, and then B on the bottom is the sort of featureless plane of sound, where the lines that are vertical represent these sort of the divisions upon which thought sound evolves. So in other words, he's talking about how language takes shape with these linguistic units that form the bridges between these two potentially amorphous masses before they're named, thought and the sonic topography around us. But I'm not using it for that. I'm using it because I feel like it's a beautiful illustration of a gap. And I'm thinking about gap in many ways, considering a gap as between a thing and its name, or a gap between a sound and an image. And both Walter Murch and Michel Quillon speak very well about this sort of analogy they use. Actually, is we've got this fixed gap between our eyes, a distance that's, whatever it is, 60 millimeters or something, and in our brain trying to reconcile the really slight differences between the two perspectives our eyes sends to it, it produces the concept of depth. So the gap or the difference between sound and image is somewhat like the way our brain produces depth or dimension through the different perspectives of our two eyes, except with sound and image, it's an unfixed gap. It can be a radically different sound and image, or they can be very close in theme. And so the dimension that's produced, or the dimensionality, is can be extremely small or really, really vast. It's an ever-changing kind of dimensionality. So that's one kind of gap I'm really interested in, and which I'll hopefully show you in some illustrations. Also interested in the gap as a whole which makes meaning or makes things useful. Again, in the Tao Te Ching, they talk about how there's this famous passage about how you can put 30 spokes together to make a wheel, but it's the space where there's nothing that the usefulness of the wheel depends. Or you can, pierce doors and windows into a house, and it's the space where there's nothing, where the door is, that the usefulness of the house depends. If the house doesn't have a door, if it doesn't have a place where there's nothing, then it's not a very useful house. So just as the Tao Te Ching says, just as we take advantage of what is, we should recognize the usefulness of what isn't, of what's not there. Another person who talks about wholes in a way that I think succinct is Carl Andre, who once said a whole is a thing. A thing is a whole and a thing it is not. I also like the way Samuel Beckett talks about wholes in his work when he writes about not wanting to reproduce reality, but to bore one hole after another into reality until what lurks behind it, whether it's something or nothing, begins to seep through. And also we can think about just the experience of cinema, especially with celluloid. When we're watching, it appears to be solid, but it's actually totally full of gaps or interstices where there's nothing. And in life itself, we don't have the solid continuum of experience. We move in and out vis-a-vis attention. We blink, we're with a moment or we're not. So there's, and those gaps are important, those intervals. So more generally speaking, before I go into these samples of my work, I'd say primary concerns have been questions of control and infrastructure. Infrastructure meaning the movement of things and forces and ideas. I have an interest in ways of knowing and questioning belief and questioning trust and questioning facticity. I am often looking at ways that histories are embedded in landscape, and I'm really invested in the psychological import of place. And in addition to sort of sound as a mode of domination, but also resistance. So while I work in multiple mediums, as Andrea was saying, I came to them all vis-a-vis cinema. It was the first art form I was working in, and when I think about what it is exactly that I do when I do cinema, primarily I invent blocks of movement and duration. I define intervals by pressurizing them. So when I think about constructing something, it's often first and foremost about how much pressure does each individual shot have, and how do the successive shots that follow or come before either release that pressure or build it up. So in a way, it's a very volumetric kind of sculptural way to think about constructing in time. And I also really like that we have this power to disassociate sight from sound, or to play with this unfixed gap that Keown and Murch talk about, that we can disassociate seeing from speaking or seeing from hearing. Okay, so some clips. I tried to think of examples of films and projects which fed into Hacked Circuit in some way, that the thinking that was behind these older projects sort of led to this current film. This was a film from In Order Not to Be Here that looked at the ways that privacy and safety and convenience and surveillance determine our environment. So it considered these cycles of fear and safety, like the more fear we have of other, or what is not us, or what we don't know, and the more we construct distance or walls between ourselves and others, and sort of in a reaching towards a feeling of safety, we produce more conditions for fear because there's more walls and there's more distance. So I guess I was frustrated by that cycle. And this film came out of that. So it was shot entirely at night, and it keeps looking at the sort of hermetic nature of white-collar communities and a kind of fear that's behind contemporary suburban design. So I'll show 3 clips that happen, one sort of near the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the end. And I hope this works. This is the first. I guess I chose it because I feel like the idea of the gap or the interval is illustrated in this case by the way a spotlight is used. Okay, so there's a lot of, I should mention this is 16 millimeter. We're looking at, obviously, like a digital file. So the film, for its first 20 minutes, is largely these kind of static landscape shots in sort of corporate parks and suburban neighborhoods. And there's, I guess to me, I felt like they were all sort of these evacuated landscapes, and I kept feeling this, maybe peculiarly 21st century, I don't know, a kind of hollowness or an emptiness that I feel like is born out of this collective faith in safety and technology. So this is a clip I wanted to show just because of that distance between, in a way, the sound that one would have been hearing at the time when I was recording and what I ended up putting over it.
Hey, do we still have an eyeball on the sky?
I'll turn it off for the clip.
Hey, where's he at? Police officer! He's got to be in one of those getaways. I see him, he's running. He's pushing up. He's running. Oh, hurry up! I'm gonna fucking hit him. The aliens, something in Ohio. Let me see your hands. It's running northbound on Ogden. Let me see your hands. I'll fucking pull you. 1200 West Ohio in the alley. The South Alley. Put your gear on the floor. 1200 West Ohio in the alley. 100? 1200. Hey, we do have him in custody, right? EDL. 2, 4. First unit that makes it up there, 1200 West Ohio, let me know. 1360, we got him in custody. 1225 West. On Ohio. That's fine, good job.
And then there's one other sequence I wanted to show. This is from the end of the film, and before this scene, the part of this scene we're seeing has already been happening for about 6 minutes before we join the runner that you're about to see. At the beginning of the film, it's found footage that I employ of Sheriff's Department helicopter surveillance footage. This scene is constructed by me, and the runner is an actor, but they look quite similar. So this you're not told until the credits when you see he's credited as a runner. And I think this following after all these quite static scenes, although you haven't seen so many of them, it ends in maybe a different kind of horror movie where these suburban locations become states of mind. So I'm definitely interested as well in a gap between technology and embodied or analog experience. Heidegger says that despite all conquest of distances, the nearness of things remains absent. And for me, it's a really important philosophical problem that we have right now. So this is one last clip I'll show.
What kind of equipment you had set up, what he planned for, there's a possibility that he did survive the fire. We want to make sure and cover every angle before we let anybody else come into the neighborhood, and we want to make sure it's safe.
So he escapes. There's a happy ending. That, I guess, was one of the pretty important things for me with that final scene, because there's such a kind of oppressive buildup of this omniscience of gaze, or just like the technologies that it's always has us sighted in some way, maybe not literally visually, but at least located, and the fact that this runner, you're not sure, it's never expressed what he's done. You see him running for a long time before this, and he's seems to be trying to run away from something, and he's obviously being pursued by authorities, but I think even though you're like, well, maybe he did something terrible, there's also a part of me that roots for the individual escaping a kind of omniscient system. So this is another film that definitely had ideas that fed into Hacked Circuit. It's another 16mm film called O'er the Land, and it's another film that's in the same type as In Order Not to Be Here, and by that I mean they're both essay films of a sort, but that don't use very much in the way of language. And this is not necessarily typical of my films, but I have made 3 or 4 of the longer works that do fall into this category of filmic structure. So the film itself is, I guess I would call it a meditation on militarized culture, but also this milieu of elevated threat. And so it keeps looking at iconic representations of national identity, as well as wilderness and consumption and patriotism, and hopefully a kind of possibility of personal transcendence alongside all that. So in the beginning, though, I was just thinking about what it is that we lose in the name of freedom. When things are done in the name of freedom, what are we giving up? Because oftentimes we are giving up something. So there's these all these sort of culturally acceptable icons of heroic national tradition that are forced together with the suggestion, I hope, of unacceptable historical consequences, so that seemingly benign locations can become zones of moral angst. This clip I wanted to show because I feel like another gap that's really important to me, or interval, is the interval of history that gets embedded into reenactment. So, a lot of times to have a social memory or even a personal memory of something, we ritualize events. We have holidays, things that recur, commemorative days to sort of help ritualize memory. And in the case of war, there's a kind of ritualizing of violence where you get this combination of spectacle and ritual. So there's a continued interest in reenactment as interval, the time between the event and then the recreation of it, and the history that's come between that sort of re-infuses the new iterations with different and changing meanings. So this is a clip from pretty near the beginning of O'er the Land.
Is that going to be on TV? Am I going to be on TV? No.
we're getting some feedback here with the mic. Oh, golly. I'm actually not going to show that clip. You hold it?
Okay.
Okay. So, this is from a bit further in the film. I'm in a total agreement with Trinh Minh Ha, who's a filmmaker and a film theorist who talks about. Sorry, now they can't hear. So I'll try to hold it. I'll try to multitask. I was saying that I am in agreement with a writer and a filmmaker named Trinh Minh Ha who talks about meaning and how it can only be political if it does not let itself be easily stabilized, when it doesn't rely on, thank you, on a single sense of authority, but rather empties authority out or decentralizes authority, so that, and this isn't Minh-Ha, but when I think about ethics, it's not a question of applying some correct abstract rule to concrete situations, but rather a much more complex operation that has empathy at its center. And so while the piece is, in a sense, a critique of violence and a rumination on our national psyche, it's also a ritualization, or a look at ritualization in a celebratory way at these colossal forces that are beyond our control. What else? What do I have to say about that? I think one other thing that maybe I haven't mentioned is that there's this kind of increasingly technological reiterations of how we've interpreted manifest destiny as Americans, and the film, as you watch it, you see scenes that sort of show that technology ratcheting up and up and up. So this is quite a bit further along in the film when you're at a higher order of ritualized warfare.
By being an American, you might take for granted all the freedoms that you do have, and when you're able to come down to a place like this and see all the freedom and the history that's involved in all of this, it's just totally amazing, because there's nowhere else in the world you could go besides the United States and experience this and feel it and smell it and own it. It's just unbelievable. I've told everybody, whether you like guns or not, whether you believe in the Second Amendment or not, you should come here and see this, because it's truly amazing. And it's what the guys are fighting for right now, just your freedom to be able to do this.
I want everybody left and right moved up. Left and right, go ahead and move up. Parking lot security, we ready on the right? Let's rock it!
So over and again throughout the film, it keeps coming back to, like I said, this kind of circular logic where when I've asked people when I was making it, about to talk about what freedom means to them or how they define it, or maybe how they define manifest destiny, but specifically freedom, a lot of times how people describe it is vis-a-vis ownership or a claiming of place, or, and if you claim a place, then you need to defend that place. And so it's this sort of oxymoronic cycle where when you say you're talking about freedom, what they're really talking about is control. And need to defend borders and protect, and so we have to ratchet up this technology to do that with. But when I personally think about freedom, I'm not thinking, it's something much more ephemeral, it's not technological, it's a kind of letting go of ego and maybe being subsumed by something much larger than myself, or a kind of transcendent sort of freedom that's not tied to ownership. So I wanted to show this last clip because it's a sequence that helps illustrate that. There's a long scene we're not looking at in the film that does that as well, that I'll speak about after this, but I'm not going to show it. I also wanted to show this scene for how it utilizes silence. When I think about what's seductive in experience, the seductive never dazzles you because of its actual qualities. You're always seduced by the feeling something creates in you when it's absent. So we're seduced by nothingness, really, and given deprivation, given something not being there, the body and the mind, they want to fill that void, they want to fill that space. And I think it's a really special place to try to work with in cinema, because that void can be experienced either as a collapse or a vacuum, and it can also be a kind of an expansion to a dimension outside of the scene that you're in the middle of. I think it's a danger with film sometimes that it fills in too much. It kind of violates our experience of the void. It's one of the dangers of cinema is it can kind of crush its subjects because it's so good at representing them, and so it kind of overtells, it doesn't have that kind of sensory incompleteness that music does, or paintings or other art forms that don't come to us in all of our senses. I really believe that it's incompleteness and what we can't have and don't have that engages the viewer. And so the challenge, I think, is always, how do we leave room for ambiguity? How do we find ways within the apparent completeness of cinema to refrain from achieving it? How do we kind of pull back? Okay, so this is a sequence that's a bit closer to the end of the film. So then more things catch on fire, and then there's a waterfall. But the story that's at the middle of the film that you're not getting is a narrative story, and it's quite unique because the rest of the film, it's not causal or narrative in its construction. It's one concept put next to the other, that together they produce meaning by their proximity, but it's not about, A begets B begets C. It's not linear in that sense. But the story is told. I'm showing two stills from a long sequence that's about 10 or 12 minutes, maybe 15, right at the middle of the movie, where all we see are clouds, and it gets darker and darker and darker. And on the soundtrack, we hear the story of this colonel, William Rankin, who in 1959 had to eject from a fighter jet at 47,000 feet, which is way above breathable atmosphere. And he survived, and the story is really intense because, he has to eject out of the plane, and then he has to survive for, I don't remember how many, a couple minutes before he drops into breathable atmosphere. So he bloats up from decompression ruptures, and he bleeds from his eyes and his ears and his mouth, and it's crazy. And then finally he passes that, and his parachute opens, and then he realizes he's on top of a massive thunderstorm. So he falls into the thunderstorm, and he's trapped in the up and down drafts for 45 minutes. So it's a very dramatic narrative story, and it's a very different kind of attention paying, because we always pay attention differently when someone's telling a story than when it's a landscape or something. So these kind of shifts of attention are equally interesting to me. And the story, it provides a kind of a central axis, like an axis mundi or a maypole that, while it's not causally related to any other scene in the film, it permeates them all and it affects them. And I think it changes how you think about, because his story is he escapes the one control force that nobody normally can unless you're an astronaut, which is gravity. And so here he is, like, flying around for 45 minutes. And to me, it's a very transcendent kind of parable right at the middle of the film, which this scene with the guy kind of stepping off this big ledge and sort of letting go to ego, letting go to his own control. For me, those are the central allegories for freedom in the film. That's a little a little sidebar. So then next I wanted to talk about some sculptural projects, but as a way to lead into them, a very short film that's like, I don't know, it's less than a minute. I'll talk about it longer than the film, called How Among the Frozen Words. And this film was inspired by a chapter in François Rabelais' 1653 epic novel Gargantua and Pantagruel, where Pantagruel, it's about a giant and his sidekick, and Pantagruel finds that all the explosions and the cries and these other sounds that were generated from a battle that had happened the year before in a sea they happened to be passing through on a boat, a frozen sea, can be released. So they're on this boat, they're near the Arctic, and it's ice everywhere, and they start grabbing some of the pieces of ice. And when they melt the ice or like throw the ice onto the deck of the ship, the sound from the battle that happened the year before is released. So it's this 17th century kind of pre-imagining of recording technology or of a record where time could have been locked into an inanimate object. And I love this story. So the title of that chapter is How Among the Frozen Words They Found Some Odd Ones, which is what this title comes from. And I'll show that briefly and then that's all there is to that. So this installation was completely related to that, and in a way related to the Foley film as well, which is why I thought it made sense to look at this project, because while the installation called Tactical Uses of a Belief in the Unseen is drawing on ecological effects of vibration and this kind of history of sonic warfare, at root, I'm really interested in the way sound both makes or produces and also can disturb space. And again, by how its nothingness, the nothingness of sound, the fact that it's not tangible, that it can be felt but not seen, how that's what seduces us about it. So the project in the very beginning started with a similar interest in this story about Gargantua and Pantagruel and how forms can contain sound, how kind of mute objects can contain time. This is an illustration by Athanasius Kircher, who was a 17th century German Jesuit polymath, and he did a number of books, and one of them was just about acoustics and these kind of proposals he had for non-electronic, like sculptural forms, basically, that would amplify sound. So these are listening devices that he proposes were built into castle walls. And normally there would be a tapestry sort of hung in front of the big end of the ear horn. And I don't know if you can see my mouse. Oh, you can't. So then this guy is supposed to be, on the other end of the horn is a sculpture. And so the king or whoever it is who's in power can like put his ear to the end of the earpiece and hear his subjects in the courtyard gossiping about him. So it's a very early kind of architectural proposal for a surveillance device. Oops, sorry. This is another one of some of his drawings, a kind of echo corral where one could stand here or here, and the built form would echo back your voice. So it's sort of a sculptural reverb system. And then I did a series of drawings based on Kircher's proposals, some of which were built. And these led me to pre-radar World War I, mostly listening devices, and how these had very beautiful sculptural forms as well. So I started collecting mostly European and American designs for ways to amplify the enemy, basically, whether it be their planes or their tanks or their ground movements. And I think just sculpturally, they're all totally amazing. And love how the way that they, they're very specifically designed, frequencies, the higher a pitch, the smaller the frequency, the smaller the wave, and so it's physically smaller, so you don't need as big of a parabola or a dish to catch it, and then the really big dishes are good at catching lower frequencies. I mean, you see something similar at like football games, sometimes if they have microphones with parabolic dishes, or ornithologists who study birds use them. It's a way of just bringing sound closer. This guy's got it. This is like the travel model. Another travel model. And we've made, some friends and I have made sort of simple versions of these, and they work incredibly well. It's surprisingly well, actually. Then also there were sort of more solid, permanent forms. These are World War I acoustic mirrors that were erected along the British coast that point towards the continent. Again, they're early warning devices that would detect incoming enemy aircraft. So like the listener would be standing here, and his head would be more or less in the middle. Maybe there'd be a podium or something to listen. So drawings were done based on that too. This is a drawing of a very early Han Chinese. Actually, they were used by Cambodians and Chinese and as early as the 6th century BC. And they were psychological operation kites where they had Aeolian harps, which are basically a type of noise, a type of instrument which makes sound just vis-a-vis the wind. So the wind activates it. And what they would do is they would fly these kites over the enemy army at night, and it would make this kind of ghosty, woo, spooky sound, which I'll play. And it was sort of an early psyops to sort of spook the enemy, basically. And I don't know how effective it was, but it's a very early psychological operation technique. Then there's more current ones, which was sort of narrativized in what is it called? Ride of the Valkyries, Wagner, in Scorsese's film. It's part of a real campaign called the Urban Funk Campaign that this division of the CIA called the Audio Harassment Division used in the Vietnam War, where they would put a set of speakers or oscillators that they called sound curdlers on the bottom of helicopters, and sometimes they would play just tones, and other times they would play music. This one we might remember. Let's see if it plays it. Oh, maybe it's not connected. I won't play it. I'm not going to play this either. There were other techniques though, where what got broadcast over the enemy beneath the army wasn't tones or music, but special tapes they would make, psyop tapes that were, the Vietnamese and the Laotians had like really these beliefs about if someone dies and they're not buried at home or near their family, that their soul wanders. And so they would make these tapes sort of, saying that there's all these wandering souls, and that the sound recording itself was a wandering soul, sort of trying to convince the Vietnamese or the Laotians or whoever it was being broadcast down again to, sort of abandon their fight, and it was a way of spooking them, basically. And then I think sonically, people are also policed or sort of subjected to sounds just by the simple fact of jets flying over that move at sonic speeds that create sonic booms, which are sounds, but they're more importantly, they're shock waves. I mean, there's a lot of campaigns, both American campaigns, Israeli campaigns by a lot of forces who employ jets that fly above the speed of sound that just intentionally fly jets over civilian populations because they're a startle control, basically. I mean, they're very oppressive. I'm not going to talk about this. This is in Korea, being broadcast from, actually both sides have it, but I think this is being broadcast from south to north, but I believe north to south has it as well, just sort of walls of sounds. There's a lot of police forces now in the US that use these things called long-range acoustic devices, or LRAD. They're basically sonic cannons that are non-lethal, but that broadcast, very intense oscillating tones. Sounds like that, but really, really loud. So all of these things went into 2 iterations of this sculpture, tactical uses of a belief in the unseen, which was basically a landscape that was also a speaker. So this is the first iteration. The gallery is really long. It's, I don't know in meters, it's 80 feet long by about 20 feet wide. And you can see the underside from outside of the gallery, but you can't access it once you go in. You can only walk on top of the landscape. And underneath the landscape are a number of subwoofers and what are called butt kickers. And they played a composition that was too low to hear with your ears. So it's below, it's below 20 hertz. So basically you can feel it, but you can't hear it. So when you walk on the floor or sit on it, you feel the composition, but you don't actually hear it with your ears. And it was composed of tank maneuvers and explosions and other sounds that typically propagate through solid surfaces instead of through the air. This is how it looked from the inside. And then the second sound source, you can see it right here barely, was an HSS speaker, which stands for hypersonic sound, and it's on a gimbal, so it's moving all the time, but randomly. And HSS speakers play sound, but only in a super directional way. So if I point it at you, then nobody else can hear it. And if I point it at you, no one else can hear it. So it's like getting a beam of sound. So if you're in the space, you're walking, and then suddenly you hear something, and it feels like it's inside your head, and then you don't hear it. So for me, it sort of evoked that wandering ghost idea, this wandering composition, and that was all composed of more declarative instruments like sirens and trumpets and bagpipes, historically associated with police states or warfare. So those were the 2 things you heard. And then in the second iteration, which was in Toronto at the Mercer Gallery, it didn't have a giant glass wall, so I needed another way to kind of evoke the geological, or the under and the over. And so in this case, I built a tunnel. So this is sort of the entrance to the gallery, and then you walk through this tunnel, and now I'm halfway into the tunnel looking back towards the entrance, and then there's this side ramp where you access the top of the sculptural surface. And then if you came out of that entrance, you'd walk up this ramp, and then you're on top of the gray topography. This is a shot from kind of up high. And this is just so you have a sense of scale. So you still have the under and over, and you still have the same two compositions, the composition you feel and the one that you encounter randomly. You wouldn't see this, but this is just how it looks underneath. And then this quote I wanted to put up because I feel like I achieved Artaud's dream of, he wanted people to feel the music through vibrations like snakes by laying on the ground, and rather than hear it, because they don't have ears in the way we do. And I came in one day to the gallery, and this is what was happening. People were literally laying down all over the surface. So they were experiencing it like snakes. Yeah. To which one? Oh, Toad, okay. Okay, yes. Yeah, I leave it up. Yeah. We should all treat the people like snakes, right? I'm happy to leave it up. Okay, so we should wrap it up. Yeah. Well, maybe we can take, instead of me showing you anything else, we can turn on some more lights in the house, and maybe I'll just put up, what will I do? Put up a good image to have up. And if people have
Víc světla,
questions,
kluci.
I can go back to anything. Nah, maybe that's an oppressive image to have up. Let's see. There's no good image. Does anyone have questions? I can't see you, so I can't tell if you have questions. So just shout them out if you do.
I have loads of questions.
Okay, well, maybe just start with one.
Okay, chronologically.
Okay, chronologically.
The first film you showed.
I'm listening. I'm just parking this on, since you guys, yeah.
Question?
Here we go.
You said that the name comes. Sorry. For the first film that you showed, the tunnel.
With the tunnel.
Yes.
Yeah.
You said that the name comes from Sir Crowley's work. Can you just make the connection, because I didn't get the.
Okay. The title is "The Name Is Not the Thing Named," and that was from a translation that Aleister Crowley did of the Tao Te Ching. Okay, so that phrase, "the name is not the thing named," I mean, I think it expresses my interest in this gap between things and their names and that interval, I guess. But also, that film is very much on some level about death, I guess, and but also not, also just about real places and experiences. But at its heart, it's trying to get something that is that language is not sufficient for, I think. That there's other experiences, there's other ways of knowing. Charles Bowden, who's a writer who died recently, but from Southwest United States, he says, what is explained can be denied, but what is felt cannot be forgotten. So, yeah, see, and to me, that's at the root of this work, but many, that there's value, of course, in language and explanation, and we need to make ourselves understood to other people, and words are convenient. But I think there's also
a kind of visceral
a
level of
kind
communicating.
Yes, a kind of knowing that's just as intellectual, but not tied to words. That I think it's difficult to talk about because it's then you're using
another
words.
Language, Okay. For me, everything that you talked about is very, very much interesting. But I'm especially interested in the work that I don't remember the name, but the escaping person.
Yes, in order not to be here.
Yes. So how did you actually film?
How did I film that?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's quite impressive. Zoom ins and zoom outs, and you had flying objects or.
Well, there weren't flying objects. I mean, I was in a flying object. Oops,
Yes,
not that.
yes.
I was in a helicopter. So the beginning of, I'm not going to go all the way back to. So the beginning there's two scenes that have shots from helicopters. One is at the beginning, and that's something I did not shoot. It's found footage from a police department, and I was interested in helicopter surveillance footage of individuals on foot outside of their car who are trying to get away and are usually apprehended. And when they shoot at night, they always use this infrared kind of photography. So I didn't have access to infrared, and I also couldn't find, what I wanted was a shot where someone's running, and then they jump into the water, and then they escape. So I called all these police departments, and nobody happened to have this image, although people kept saying that they're like, oh yes, we have something. Because I told them I was I don't know what I said, I was like a surveillance researcher and blah, blah, blah. And so they didn't have it. So then, if I had found it, I would have used it. But because I couldn't find it already existing in the world as a reality footage that police department had shot, I reconstructed it. And in this case, I used a helicopter that normally shoots the traffic and the weather report for the news. So on the bottom of the helicopter, they have a gyroscopically mounted camera, and they shoot the traffic. And the pilot agreed to take me up, and we could film it on the way back from the morning traffic report back to the airport. So what I worked out with the runner, Joaquin, is we drove to the site and we found the path that he would run, and then we went back, and then shot it with the pilot. It did take 2 takes. The first one didn't go. It was very traumatic. It's a lot of work. And the first take was very exciting because some police cars started following him, actually. And we had to call down and say, he's not a criminal. He's an actor. Yeah, the first tape didn't record, and so we were able to record it again a couple weeks later. So that's just from that. So I was in the cockpit, as was the pilot, as was the what's called a FLIR camera operator. So I just sat next to him and I said, okay, zoom in, zoom out, okay, and he just did what I told him. It was like a joystick. Yeah, that's how we shot.
Yeah, okay.
Wait, does anyone else have, because I just want to make sure. If no one else has a question, it's okay, but he's got lots. Okay.
Okay.
And we have to go after this. Yeah, I will go.
Just a short
One more
question.
question.
Yeah. It's actually, it's for me the most important question.
Okay.
So when you start working on audiovisual composition, are you led by the image first, and then you think about the sound, or the sound is the basis for the image, or how do you work actually?
It goes both ways. So every film is different. Some things I have the audio much before. Others I have no idea what the audio will be, and I fill it in later. And then sometimes I use sound from the site. It's all sync sound. Other times it's completely Foleyed and constructed. So every you only saw kind of one style of film today, but each style of piece calls for a different use of sound. Sometimes I work with composers who make the music, but usually I do all the sound collage myself. So it's half of the movie, I think. Sound is half of a movie, and if you choose not to use it, that's still half the movie. A silent film does a real specific kind of work, right? So that choice, I think, needs to be very deliberate, when we use and when we don't. But it's always different.
Thank you.
So I have to go, it seems, and maybe you do too. But I'm around at the ceremony and later this evening, so you can find me that way, or perhaps I see you wandering around and you can just grab me if you have a question. Thank you.